everyone, and welcome to Leading in a New Reality. My name is Elizabeth Fitzsimons. I'm Vice President of Leadership and Engagement at LEAD San Diego, which is an affiliate of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. At LEAD San Diego, we're focused on connecting, educating, and empowering leaders for positive change. And we do that through professional and leadership development programming, board matching, and working with local nonprofits to maximize their effectiveness in the community. This series is produced in partnership with Jones, a company whose mission is to develop leaders and human systems that counter oppression through diversity, inclusion, and organizational effectiveness. This is a webinar that's meant to help you understand what's happening in our ever-changing world and connect you with sources of inspiration and empowerment, and most importantly, equip you with the tools you need to help you lead your teams and your families. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed by our partner at ABC 10 News. Thank you, 10 News. Please, if you have questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send us those questions, and we'll also take questions from our viewers on Facebook as well. My colleague and program manager, Kim Nguyen, is monitoring those questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can today. Today's topic is police reform. Since the police killing of George Floyd earlier this summer and the earlier killing of Breonna Taylor, two cases in a lengthy history of police killing unarmed Black men and women in our country, there have been protests and a movement for police reform. Today we're going to break things down, and we hope you'll leave today's program with a deeper understanding of the police reform movement and also ideas for what you can do to be involved if you feel called to do so. I'm very grateful to our guests for joining us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. Councilmember Monica Montgomery represents District 4 on the San Diego City Council, and she grew up in her district. She earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Spelman College and a Juris Doctor from California Western School of Law. Councilmember Montgomery serves on several committees, including serving as chair of the Committee on Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods, and vice chair of the Committee on Economic Development and Intergovernmental Relations. She also serves on the Committee on Budget and Government Efficiency and the Rules Committee. The council member also is a board member for San Diego Community Power, which provides alternative renewable energy sources to San Diego Gas and Electric. The council member also has several outside agency appointments, including MTS, SANDAG, and the Reinvestment Task Force. In June, Councilmember Montgomery introduced a proposal for the Office of Race and Equity to provide education and technical support to city staff, local law enforcement, and elected officials, leading to the recognition and mitigation of systemic bias and barriers to fair and just distribution of resources, access, and opportunity. Welcome, Councilmember Montgomery.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Joshua Chanin is Associate Professor in the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. There he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in both the public administration and criminology criminal justice programs. Trained as a lawyer with a Ph.D. in public administration, Dr. Chanin's scholarly interests lie at the intersection of law, criminal justice, and governance. Much of the professor's work has focused on policing, which brings him to us today. He has written extensively about the U.S. Department of Justice's Pattern or Practice Initiative, with a focus on the implementation and sustainability of federal efforts to remedy systemic misconduct among state and local police departments. He is currently working on a project related to police transparency. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Jerry Sanders is President and CEO of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce and our former mayor and police chief. Jerry began his lifelong career in public service when he joined the San Diego Police Department at age 22, fulfilling his dream of becoming a police officer and following in his father's footsteps. He ascended the police department ranks, becoming one of the youngest police chiefs in the city's history. And as chief, Jerry and his team gained national recognition for work with community policing and achieving a 40% decrease in crime, including a 67% drop in murders. In 1999, Jerry Sanders retired from the police force and became CEO of the United Way of San Diego. 3 years later, he chaired the board of the local chapter of the American Red Cross, guiding it out of crisis and restoring trust and transparency. In 2005, with his reputation as a successful turnaround executive, Jerry was persuaded to run for mayor to tackle the pension crisis, which had left the city heading toward bankruptcy. After winning in a special election, Mayor Sanders immediately launched a top-to-bottom review and streamlining of city operations and restored the city to firm financial ground. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
All right, well, thank you all for being with us today. First, I think it'd be helpful if we just started with a level set. If I can get all three of you to address this question, what does police reform mean to you? And I'd like to start with the council member.
Thank you. This is a good question because I remember when I was running for this seat and had to make a decision as to what our platform would be. And at that time, it was only about 3 years ago. And it was still very popular to address this issue under the guise of public safety. And I decided to use police reform in my platform and be very frank and upfront about what that meant and why we needed it and why I was running, as a part of my platform. So what it means to me is it means a change of course as to how we police, and particularly communities of color. It means that we change how we view each other. I always say that we can have a lot of police reform. We can have duty to intervene policies. We can have a community review board on police practices, soon to be hopefully an independent commission on police practices. We can have all those things in place. And if we still don't see each other as human beings, they will not work. And so we have to, there are a lot of things in society that we have to deal with. This is a large part of what has, oftentimes police departments are seen as the guard for the type of society that we have, which some people are treated better than others. And so we have to change that from the inside out. And so that's what police reform means to me.
Thank you, Council Member. Jerry, what does police reform mean to you?
Well, I think the council member really talked about the important issues in it. It's really acknowledging that you work for the community in every community in San Diego. And it's also working to achieve a community conversation that allows the community to direct the policing efforts. And it means face-to-face contact on a frequent basis. Communities know what the issues they are facing, and they're frequently different than what the police department thinks are the issues. And we find that when you work with the community, when they give you a set of priorities, and you're able to feed back what's happened over a week or a 2-week or a month period, you can close that loop, which allows the transparency that communities desire. But it also allows you to have those conversations and to get to know the community. And I think that's especially important in a lot of the communities in San Diego that felt like they have not had a word in about the way they're policed and about the way they're treated. So I think Councilmember Montgomery was completely correct in what she said.
Thank you, Jerry. Josh, what is your take?
Well, I think I agree with both the council member and Jerry. The way that I would, first of all, I appreciate the question because police reform means lots of things to lots of different people. I guess what I would say is that I see police reform as part of a much bigger reassessment of the way that our society functions, the way that our civic institutions work, and what our priorities are as a society, as a community. Police disparities center in Black and brown communities, as do crime figures, poverty numbers, unemployment numbers. This is not a coincidence. It's a reflection of the way that we have set up our society, and to narrowly target policing for reform well, all of this other stuff, all of these other sort of systemic inequalities are allowed to persist, will inevitably lead to short-run changes that aren't sustainable. And so I think what I would emphasize is the importance of police reform as a part of a larger conversation. And adding on to that, I would say that when we do get into the nitty-gritty of talking about policing and police reform, I would point to two things. First is sustainability. We've seen, and the story of Jerry Sanders epitomizes this really clearly, that when you have a charismatic leader who's progressive and reform-minded, oftentimes the changes that he or she brings on will dissipate when their term is over or when it's time for them to move on. And I think that the most important thing that we can target is sustainable, lasting change. And that really, I think, is only possible if we follow Jerry's advice about community-led and community-incorporated change.
Great, thank you, Josh. I want to get back to that in a little bit, but first I wanted Jerry to talk about the essay that he recently had in the opinion pages of the San Diego Union Tribune. And Kim is going to drop a link in the chat for those who'd like to look at it. And I'd like to share a couple quick little excerpts now. In it, he writes, "It is past time for simple introspection. We need a complete rethinking of policing, beginning with hiring and training. Different skill sets are needed, emphasizing critical thinking and understanding of the historical context of policing in poor and racially and ethnically diverse communities, communications and de-escalation proficiency and problem solving." He also says that police need to stop pretext stops and the overuse of stop and frisk. And he also says that to make systemic change, the California Police Officers Standards and Training Commission should immediately completely revamp police academy training and stop emulating any form of military training. Jerry, what compelled you to write this essay?
Well, you know, I've got a little bit longer history than the rest of the people up here, only because I'm older. But we've been through this before. We were through this in the 60s. We were through it in the 50s. It went through the 70s. It continues on, the same pattern. And each time we say that we're going to be introspective and we're going to think about fixing the issues and we're going to have sensitivity training and we're going to work closely, and none of that's worked. We have a very short attention span. And I think I was really frustrated with the way I see policing across America and the incidents that brought it to a head once again. And then the lack of understanding that the police departments are not military. They're not designed to be military. They don't encounter the things that the military does. In fact, they have a completely different skill set needed in that they go into people's homes every day. They're the only 24-hour person you can call to come and solve problems at your house. Those can be family issues, which police officers are not necessarily trained well in. Those are psychological issues. Those are substance abuse issues. Those are issues dealing with all sorts of patterns. And yet we don't train and we don't select and we don't train in communication in a lot of those different things. Instead, we've fallen back on calling police paramilitary, which compartmentalizes them into people thinking that we've got to have an academy with a drill instructor and they've got to toe the line and they have to do all this. That's not what a police academy should look like. It should be a place where you're taught critical thinking, where you're questioning, where you're learning how to de-escalate, where you're learning the historical context. I literally did not understand the historical context of policing in African-American communities until I was a captain on the police department, and a community leader took me aside and said, "Look, you don't understand this. We know that things like that are not happening specifically in San Diego, but they're happening in LA. They're happening all across this country. And you want it to be in a certain time like this month. And we're looking at the historical context through 100 years. And I think that has to be understood so that the police officers are prepared when they go out and work with the community, that they can understand the pain, they can understand the patterns of discrimination, and they can also understand what it takes to really start paying attention to those communities, taking them up and helping them tell the police what they need to do. I think all of it's much under context, and all of that is governed by the state. They lay out a curriculum for every police academy in the state. It's exactly the same. You have objectives, you have to fulfill those objectives. And when you want to change any of those to tailor them to your specific department, it's very difficult to do that. And I think that those objectives may have made sense 50 years ago, but they certainly make no sense now.
Can you say a little bit more, Jerry, on the paramilitary? I mean, how did we get to that point? What was
Well, I think that unfortunately, when Bill Clinton was president, he put a lot of emphasis on community policing. The funding sources in the federal government that allowed police departments to get funding for training or to get funding for equipment or to get funding for exploring new ideas was all based on the community policing problem solving models. And police departments, like other government agencies, like everyone else, follows the funding stream. So when BJA or NIJ or Department of Justice says we're going to give grants out in community policing and working in your communities and police officers training and all of that, that's what the department started moving to. And there were a lot of very successful models. San Diego was one of them, but there were a lot of departments that took it and did it very well. When 9/11 hit, it obviously rocked the United States. We'd not had anything like that happen to us before. The funding stream changed overnight. Department of Justice started funding weapons systems and started funding surveillance training and all sorts of different things that were almost contradictory to exactly to what community policing was about. When in fact, community policing could have been just as useful by using sources in the community to know what was going on. But that was where the funding went, and that's where departments started switching more to the military model, at least in my estimation.
Thank you, Jerry. Councilmember, in June, the San Diego City Council received quite a lot of public input on the budget, and specifically the funding of the police budget. And there were many calls to defund the department or reduce its funding. Councilmember, what was that like, hearing all that testimony, and what came out of that process?
So yes, that was a long meeting. It was about 11 hours, I think. And so there was a call to defund. And, there are different definitions of that, just like there are different definitions of police reform. Mm-hmm. There are folks who want to eliminate police departments altogether or law enforcement altogether. And then there are those that want to divert and reallocate funding to other sources. So, the backdrop that we are in now of social unrest, pandemic, it all really, that meeting was sort of a perfect storm of all of those things. There are a lot more people paying attention, and that is a good thing. People were able to call in and did not have to travel. So that is also a good thing, that we are keeping the community voice lifted. As we move forward in this process, I think it's very, very important for us to communicate with community members about, process and things that we have to go through within City Hall to make some of the asks happen, which is something that my office has been very, very good at, and have, at that time kind of struggled a little bit through the pandemic of actually being able to continue to lift up that voice. And so it was eye-opening for me, to just, I was proud of community members for calling in. I think we had, 400 calls or something like that. And also, it was, there's a political side to it. And it was disappointing, that a lot of folks didn't understand that. And so we're constantly talking about that. But again, when we go back to this backdrop, we have to look at it maybe not from the eye of an insider, right? We have unemployment that has risen. It's starting to trickle back down now, but it at that time was at its height. We had food lines that were longer or as long as they've been since the Depression. And we had a budget where we, from the community's point of view, were giving an increase of $27 million to the police department when all of this pain and suffering is going on in our community. So I can understand the frustration and the anger behind that. Now, there are some technical things that I can explain too, but the point is, this is what we are working with. And this is why there is a call to divert and reallocate those funds. So what we did was we called for our independent budget analyst at the city of San Diego to do a deep dive into the police budget, because I think that we need to look at it in that way. We just heard Jerry talk about, some money conversations that we may not know about, and when I make those types of decisions, I like to have all the information in front of me. And I didn't feel comfortable enough with what I had. So we should be in the Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods Committee looking at that deep dive before the year is out, and really just determining, whether we can divert and reallocate and still, keep the public safety function of the police department. I think that we have a responsibility to do that. I agree that these efforts should be community-led. I do think the one thing that has been missing is an actual investment in those community-led efforts. We have nonprofit organizations and people who are experts in this space, know how to quell violence and keep it down without using some of the tactics that sometimes our officers have to use, and have not yet been seen as the experts that they are. And so we have to invest our capital, some of our budget into those things, I believe, as we balance what law enforcement and the role of law enforcement. We still believe that law enforcement is at the center of our community. I also know that there are organizations that work in these spaces that go places that we can't always go, and they need to be backed up with some financial assistance and be a part of our budget conversations. So I think that there's a merit in this discussion and in that campaign of defunding.
Could you give some examples of where some of those allocations could be going, just to give folks kind of an idea of what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I will say, I think some of the officers agree with me in this, is that some of our work around mental health issues and responding to those, some of our work around our homelessness issues, we never want to see an increase in any kind of gang violence or activity. We have people that are able to go into some of those spaces in a less threatening way, and really talk down and talk through some of those issues with some of the younger people. And so those are some examples. We have things that are going on across the state. I think it's called something a little bit different now, but it's around this idea of having credible messengers, people who have been a part of those lifestyles before and are no longer, and they can go and talk and have more of an impact to lead folks in the right direction. So we have a lot of things. You just have to get creative about that, package it up, and make it viable, because I believe that there is a way, and I think we need to find that balance.
Thank you. Josh, can you share any examples from other communities around the country who have had some creative approaches to the defunding or the reallocation of resources?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that, Elizabeth, you're right to focus on individual communities. I think it's worth sort of underscoring the importance of individual jurisdictions and the communities that comprise those jurisdictions. When we talk about police reform, it tends to be done on a national level or even a statewide basis. And this is really a local issue. I read a study recently that quoted among 258 agency respondents to a survey, half or approximately half were experiencing budget cuts or were expecting budget cuts. So this initiative is happening in cities and towns across the country. And what these changes look like, I think, range from efforts to reinvest in drug diversion programs, for example. Some of the violence interrupter programs that the council member mentioned are part of that. Switching the approach from responding to violent incidents or criminal incidents to preventing those things and giving community members the sorts of resources that they need to live whole lives. What it looks like in Portland is different from what it looks like in Seattle or in Austin, Texas. And to my mind, the specific strategies that are being pursued are much less important than two things. First is the speed with which this is all happening. The political will that exists for reform today was unfathomable 6 months ago. And so that's the first thing. But that is sort of incongruous with this other phenomenon, which is that we have seen the protests and the murder of George Floyd slip off the front pages. And there is some sense that in certain communities, this issue is being covered less intently. And I fear that with this lack of coverage and lack of attention will come a reduction in the political will that is motivating some of the real changes that are making their waves across the country. I would follow up by saying the reforms that I've seen sort of revolve around a couple things. First is transparency and accountability. I think that there's a lot of attention paid to gathering good data and investing in the resources needed to analyze and produce a sophisticated evaluation of what these data show and disseminate that widely in understandable ways. And then there are other sort of more narrow-minded use of force kind of tactical reforms, the carotid artery restraint, and the elimination of other aggressive techniques that we've seen here in San Diego County and in other jurisdictions, I think is another group of reforms that I'm starting to see.
Thank you. So we've talked about at a high level what this movement is about and what communities are doing. But let's talk about like why the need for this, right? Josh, you co-authored a study a few years ago that found that Black people were more likely than white people to be subject to field interrogation interviews by San Diego police officers. Can you tell us more about that research?
Sure, yeah. So about 4 years ago, a team of researchers and I were contacted by Marty Emerald and members of her staff to evaluate a bunch of traffic stops that were collected by the SDPD between 2014 and 2015. And we analyzed about 260,000 traffic stops and found not only that Black and Hispanic drivers were subject to more aggressive field interrogation enforcement than similarly situated white drivers, but they were also massively disproportionate in terms of searches. So post-stop searches affected Black and brown drivers significantly more than they did white drivers stopped under similar conditions. And this is really important to see in light of the fact that there was no difference by race of those people or the odds that those people were going to be caught with illegal drugs or guns or any other contraband. So stops of Black and brown people were happening much more often, but were less productive. So that's the first sort of major quantitative finding. We found no racial difference in terms of arrest data, which means that there was no probable cause to initiate arrest by race, which is another sort of indication that the stops of and post-stop enforcement of Black and brown individuals were less efficient. Among those 260,000 stops, just 1.3% led to an arrest. So that is a stunning figure, and again underscores the inefficiency of the use of traffic stops to pursue information or enforcement pretextually. these data, they're of a piece with hundreds, literally hundreds of other studies from jurisdictions around the country. We were not surprised by them. The Black and brown members of our community were not surprised by them. I think they echo the reality of being in their cars and being stopped by officers. We also had the fortune of being able to survey and interview dozens of officers. We surveyed close to 400 and interviewed over 50 officers at length. And I think it's worth recounting what we found in those conversations, because I think it sort of provides some context for this broader conversation about reform and how difficult it really is going to be. First of all, the vast majority of people we surveyed and spoke to felt that race, racial bias, racial disparities were a non-issue. They very much subscribe to the rotten apple theory. If there may be one or two officers that are racist or engaging in these sorts of biased behaviors, and the department does a great job of finding them and weeding them out. So, in other words, officers that we spoke to did not see this as a systemic problem. They saw that the issue was drummed up by the media, by people who held anti-police perspectives, and liberals of the political class. Another important aspect of this sort of neutralization is the widespread use of coded language that was very, very clearly used to refer to particular racial groups or ethnic groups. The use of gangbangers, the use of the term bad guys contrasted with soccer moms. There was this sort of coded race-neutral language that was used to distinguish groups, good guys from bad guys, and as a way to justify the more aggressive enforcement behaviors in certain communities. We also found a significant distrust of non-police. There was an overwhelming number of people that we spoke to and surveyed that felt like the issues that were to come of our report and the conversations that it was to spur were going to be skewed and interpreted through ignorant lenses, because people didn't really know what it was meant to be a cop and the stresses and the emotion of what it's like to be on the beat. Mm-hmm. And finally, we found a really troubling strain of open admission of lack of compliance with the department's rules. The department's rules mandating data collection efforts. People simply said, I don't think it's worth it to do it. It puts me in jeopardy of being labeled a racist or getting in trouble with my boss. So I either choose not to engage in a traffic stop, choose not to fill out the report, or lie about the race or ethnicity of the driver that I stopped. So the reason that I spend so much time talking about this is to say that the changes that are going to be asked of the police department, whether they come from the top or from the bottom, are going to be met with resistance. There's a long history of police departments led by the police union in many cases, resisting efforts to change the way that the department functions. There's been a huge investment in the status quo. And I think as we endeavor to initiate substantive reforms, we ought to be mindful of the fact that this is not going to be easy, and it's going to take sustained effort from people like Councilmember Montgomery and her constituents citywide.
Thank you, Josh. Well, Councilmember, how do you push through that resistance, and how does the Office of Race and Equity play into this?
It's certainly not going to happen overnight. This is what we talk about with a cultural shift. Oftentimes when I talk to officers, there is a bias there when I speak to them that is not recognizable by them oftentimes. I'm generalizing, that doesn't mean everyone, but I can see what Dr. Shannon is talking about, because it is so deep in our culture, as it is deep in our society, that we are conditioned to believe certain things about certain people. I'll just give you a quick recent example. You know, the situation in Ocean Beach with the gathering.
Yeah.
That is, I'm glad that the city and law enforcement are trying to work with those folks. But if that happened in southeastern San Diego, it would be different. And there would be no, not much, other than by Jerry, of a thought process about that type of distinction, how we treat people differently. That's in my mind, a very glaring example. And so, yes, we're going to have to work through those. And I think this was said in the beginning of this talk, this panel, is that if we just focus on this police reform, there's so many societal issues that affect the way that we communicate with each other, the way that we interact with each other. So we have to work on all of it. And then that's what the Race and Equity Office is about. And it is not, we live in a society where we do want instant gratification for the things that we do, even in government now. And we just know that these things are long-term issues. The study that Dr. Shannon referenced was 4 or 5 years ago. And now is the time when I think we are being enlightened on these issues now and understanding our own biases and how we can change, but it still takes time. It's been 400 years for Black folks, and the treatment and the conditioning that it is normal to treat, people of color differently. And we have to attack and address that. The Race and Equity Office, we're hopeful that is going to, bring up many of the policies forward within the city that we've never really looked at before as being contributing to some of the discrimination, some of the issues that we have. And I was purposeful in using the word race and not diversity inclusion. When I first introduced this last budget cycle, I did use those words, but I think it's very important for us to nail this, to treat it as what it is, to get through those hard conversations, because if we don't do that, we'll be back here in a few years. So I think that the office is really going to bring many of those things to light. And then we will work on how to change them. But it's a very, it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight because it has been ingrained in us for so long.
Are you worried about losing momentum? Josh had mentioned, hey, right after George Floyd was killed, the San Diego PD and then all the other police agencies in the county ended their use of the chokehold, right? So it seemed like, wow, a lot was happening right away. Do you see, and Josh had said that things are starting to drop off the front page. Are you starting to see a decline in momentum, and are you worried about that? It sounds like that this office will kind of keep things moving and be sort of a connector to various parts of the city.
Well, that is always a concern. But as I mentioned before, I started this when police reform wasn't as, popular as it is now. It was still something that the community members in Southeastern San Diego especially were very aware of. But I plan to stay the course because I think this work is very, very important. And I'm hopeful that we can keep it at the forefront of folks' minds. Yes, the office, I believe, is a huge institutional change. And the goal is that it goes beyond me and that it is something that the city looks to right a lot of these wrongs that have been going on. It's always a concern about momentum, but I believe that I have to try to do the right thing no matter what, as my grandmother would say, in season and out of season. And so we're going to stick to that and do what we have to do, because it may not always have the momentum, but I do believe it will always be the right thing.
Thank you, Councilmember. Jerry, what needs to happen for significant, sustainable change?
Well, I think that, you know, the momentum is carried on. I mean, not to the same degree, but I live near City Heights and I see protesters on the bridges. When I say protesters, I'm talking about people drawing attention to Black Lives Matters every weekend. I've seen marches in Trolley Barn Park, and I'm only talking about the neighborhoods I go in. So it may not be top of mind for press, but I certainly think it's top of mind for a generation right now. It's a generational issue right now. And I think that's what is going to make this, it's a very difficult issue, as both the council member and Josh have said. There are a lot of moving parts, and Josh was right. This is just one piece of it, policing. There's a lot of other parts to this that are even more difficult. Policing may be the easiest issue to solve when you start getting into some of the other issues that nobody is ever going to want to talk about. So I do think there'll be willing partnerships with a generation on the police department. I think the police department will play a role in this. I know Josh and I had talked about police unions and their role. Some of the police unions around the United States are Neanderthals. I mean, I just want to be very clear about that. They make it so you can't fire police officers even if they've done horrible things. San Diego Police Officers Association, I don't believe is that way. They worked hand in glove with us. We did a voluntary disparity study in about 1998, and the Police Officers Association joined us in encouraging the officers to do that. We've seen them, you know, literally saying that it's time for a new commission. I think they've not been an impediment in that. And I think that they have a younger generation of police officers who are going to help transform. And I think you've got the leadership on the department to really engage with Councilmember Montgomery. I think the one thing that Josh brought up that in its training, you play like you train. If you get trained to do things in a certain way, you're going to do it. And analytics is a big part of that. And if the statistics show out of 260,000 traffic stops, you have an inordinate disparity on some people, and you still get such a small amount of bang for your buck with 1.3% of the arrests, I think officers are pretty good at looking at data now. They have more data than they've ever had, and I think that can help lead to the changes in policing we really need to think about. So those studies are critically important as we move forward.
Thank you. We always ask our guests on this webinar for an action item for our viewers. And I want to do that before we take a couple more questions from our audience. Councilmember Montgomery, what would you have our viewers do when they leave this webinar to become better informed or more engaged on this topic?
So please visit San Diegans for Justice. We are working on getting passage of Measure B. I think Jerry just mentioned this independent commission on police practices that will give the commission subpoena power, investigative powers, and independent counsel. We think this is a great step towards transparency and accountability. And also, I just real quick want to say I am grateful for my relationship with the chief of police, and just, you know, we don't agree on everything, but there is a willingness to try. And so I just do want to say that. But yes, San Diegans for Justice, Measure B, please support this major measure for transparency and accountability.
Thank you. How about you, Josh?
I think that I would have people think about a story that I heard recently that really sort of resonated with me. My mom had an incident this morning that demanded us call the police department. And, you know, we had no fear whatsoever in calling the cops. We knew exactly, or we expected, the kind of treatment that we would receive. You know, I live in a middle-class neighborhood in La Mesa. I am white, my mom is white, my wife is white. And the expectations that we had of the police officer were for professionalism and respect. And so to my mind, when somebody like me calls the cops, we expect the cops to address the problem. When somebody who does not look like me, who's my age and who has black skin, calls the cops, the feelings are dramatically different. And when the police are seen as someone or an organization that may be causing problems rather than solving problems, it really gets you to think about where the notion of Black Lives Matter comes from, where the need for reform comes from. And so I would like people to think about the differences that they experience, law enforcement and police institutions, from the way that their neighbors and other communities do. That really sort of crystallized the differences. And I think that if people are sit with that a little bit, then maybe some of this will resonate.
Thank you. It goes back to your study. I mean, the different realities that we're living in, right?
Yep.
Jerry.
Well, I agree with Councilmember Montgomery on the willingness of the San Diego Police Department. And I haven't been speaking to them during this, but I do think they have good leadership, and I think they're willing to engage and willing to learn. I guess the other thing that I want people to know is I drive around the neighborhood and I see some people putting up signs that say, "We support our police." And I see a neighbor next door have signs that say, "Black Lives Matter." And, I would hope that people can understand both of those things are true. That by supporting your police and allowing them to know that, but also acknowledging that you want better policing, is not mutually exclusive. I mean, I just think it's really important we all look at this. And I think Josh's story was excellent. My neighborhood knows what to expect when we call a police officer. Not every neighborhood knows that. And I think that those are the fundamental changes. We need to support the police, but we need to support each community that's in San Diego.
We have a question from one of our guests that asks about engaging in conversations about police reform with people who take Black Lives Matter as that police lives don't matter. How do you kind of get past that barrier and have that conversation? I'll throw that to the panel, and anyone want to jump in?
I'll just be quick. I found that even in this time where it is important to just discuss some of the facts. I think the emotion is very real and strong and helps motivate us. But now we have studies, and we have AB 953 at the state level that has mandated certain documentation be kept. And so we have things that we can make sound policy from. And I think that helps in conversations. But also the humanization aspect of it, I think what Josh talked about with just really thinking about the privilege that oftentimes in certain neighborhoods, white people tend to have, even some of the privilege that others of us tend to have. Thinking those things through is extremely important, and talking those things out, asking questions if someone says something you may not agree with. Why do you think that? And having, again, it goes back to treating each other like human beings, even if we don't agree. I just think that's really, really important right now, because it's going to be important for us as we go through this and make a better America, a better San Diego, a better California, that we at least begin to try to understand each other. And that doesn't always have to be a bad thing. I can still fight for what I believe. I can still, have a strong opinion about what I believe and listen to someone else's opinion, unless it's just downright hateful and disrespectful and those things. But if we talk to people, we will find out that oftentimes it is not. And then we need to talk those things out. But facts are important.
That's good advice. Thank you. Jerry or Josh, you want to chime in on this one, navigating those conversations?
I would just underscore everything that the council member has said. I think having an open mind, being willing to listen to your friends and neighbors and your crazy uncle who holds views that you may disagree with, try to find out what's motivating their views and interrogate your own views is the way that I try to approach these conversations.
Great, thank you. Jerry, any perspective on that one?
Well, it's a difficult issue.
Yeah.
In a police culture, you learn to depend on each other. You're out seeing things a lot of people don't really realize that you see. You're exposed to a lot of things, and I think sometimes the culture becomes closed unless you really work at keeping it open.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of officers do that, and a lot of officers are somewhat damaged sometimes on what they see and how they feel some attacks coming that, even though they're rightfully done, but they may be phrased inarticulately by some people. I think it's what Monica said. We've got all got to be people and just start talking a little bit more. And I certainly don't agree with everybody I talk to about anything. And yet I'm always willing to have a conversation. And, you know, I learn something every time, even as old as I am from right now, for crying out loud. So I think that's what we need in just about everything we're doing right now with this fundamental change with society.
Yeah, I love that approach. Thank you, Jerry.
Elizabeth, can I just add one thing?
Of course.
You know, I think Jerry's comment about what police see and what they experience, I think is really important. And there is a very easy way to understand, at least, you know, for one night or one afternoon, what they go through. Take a ride along. They can really open your eyes to the challenges that police officers face. You're in a car, and I'm not sure actually whether they're doing them now because of COVID. But you really do have a chance, you know, one-on-one or one-on-two to ask questions, to ask the officers to explain the decisions that they've made, and to really observe the things that they're seeing and experiencing. And, you know, no matter where you fall on the ideological spectrum or what your views are of reform, seeing firsthand what the job holds, I think can teach us all a lot.
I think that's such an excellent idea, and I totally agree with you. I started my career as a reporter, as a crime reporter, and did a lot of ride-alongs, and it was really eye-opening. It's very eye-opening about what the officers are faced with. So, great idea. We have another question about, this one has to do with kids. Let's see, is there value in teaching our children in school how to interact with police? And also teaching police how to interact with school-age students at all grade levels. Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I have a 6-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter, and I will not profess to tell anybody how to treat their own kids or how to talk to their own kids about these issues. But what I can tell you that my wife and I have done is to be as honest and as open about, you know, the protests, about the role that police play in our society, their flaws, the flaws of the system, the need for law enforcement, and to try to keep it as real as we can. And I think that kids are smart, kids are savvy, and they're much more understanding of the complexity of these public problems. And so we have not had an easy time of it. It's been really hard, but we've at least tried to take it on. And that's been, I think, a good thing for us.
Councilmember, how do you think we should be talking to kids about this?
That's a good question. I don't have any children. I have nephews. And I have children around, but it is tough. But I think, like Josh said, like the kids that are in my life, the children that are in my life are like so wise and very understanding. And, you know, you think you have to break things down to them. Sometimes you can just have conversations with them, right? They're very, very wise and really built for this time. And so that to me is very much a blessing. But I think being open and not shying away from maybe questions that they have, they're surrounded by this right now. And so it is, I think, a really good to have a place for them to land and be able to talk through some of their issues and some of their emotions. I think that's very, very important right now.
Gary, you want to chime in on the kids question?
I honestly, I don't know what to say. You know, kids are, they're smart. They see what's going on. And, you know, my experience in policing is that kids love you until they're teenagers and then they hate you. So it's not much different than being at home.
Yeah, this is true of parents.
So, I mean, I just think you listen to them and you talk to them and you explain things the best you can, but you let them talk about it instead of explaining to them all the time. Let them bring up the solutions. And, you know, I'm just like, the kids are smarter than we think they are. I don't think we give them the benefit of the doubt on that a lot of the time because we're just not in their shoes at that point.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember, we have one more question, and it's asking for a little bit more detail on your reasoning during that city council meeting to fund the police department at the requested level.
Yeah, so going through the budget process, it really does start in January as we make those final decisions in June. And like I said, after that vote, we did ask our independent budget analysts for a deep dive into the police budget that we should be reviewing before the end of the year. We also did something unprecedented with the appropriations ordinance that codifies the budget decisions that we made, and we did set aside $29 million for possible diversion and reallocation. My issue is simply this: there were a couple of just procedural things that we need a certain amount of votes in order to change what the mayor brings to us. So that was part of it. But also, I really want to do this right. I really do. And I think that there is such a legitimate ask in that. And some call it defunding, some call it reallocating. I think there's a legitimate issue there. I think in order to do it right, we need to have the information in front of us. And so that's what I've asked for. And so I will continue on that road and do what we need to do and try to galvanize partners around that. But I want to secure a plan, which I am asking the community to come back to me with some of the suggestions they have as well.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate it. It's time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much to our guests, Councilmember Monica Montgomery, Professor Joshua Chanin, and Jerry Sanders for being with us today and providing us with some understanding and some tools for action. We'll be back on Wednesday, September 2nd at 2 p.m. for a discussion on voting and breaking down barriers to voting against the backdrop of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Again, thank you to our panelists and thank you all for joining us. And on behalf of Lead San Diego, I wish you all well. Thank you.